Good morning. How are you? I'm a day late. It's Monday morning instead of Sunday morning, but my guess is nobody's going to notice. So we're going to look at employment laws. This is part one. There will be three parts to this because there's quite a bit to explore and explain. So the first thing we're going to look at are the terms that come up. There's prima facie, which talks about when somebody has a case and on the face of it, it is very favorable to the plaintiff. So it's called prima facie on the face of it. And if that case is not rebutted by the person that they are suing, the case will be won by the plaintiff. I think that made sense. Shall we try it again? Let me get the official way that it's said, but it's basically on the face of it. If the case is so good, and there's no contest to it from the defendant or the person that they are bringing into court, then that case will stand. You have vesting, and vesting is when you have spent enough time or waited a long enough waiting period, you become vested. And that's used very often in pension plans. You normally have to work with a company for a year before you're vested in the pension plan, which means you have authority and you have power now and you have control of that investment plan. You have disparate impact discrimination and disparate treatment discrimination. The disparate impact is unintentional discrimination, and that's usually brought about by institutional policies or certain circumstances within the job that really requires you to have these specific skills. So sometimes inadvertently others are discriminated against. So that's unintentional. Disparate treatment discrimination is intentional discrimination, where an employer simply makes a choice and has bias, and it shows in their employment practices. We have bona fide occupational qualification, which is a fancy way of saying characteristics that are reasonably necessary, okay, for the operation of a normal business. And sometimes those characteristics, alrighty, go and are discriminatory. And they can be a defense against discrimination. And lastly, we have employment at will, which is where we're really going to start off on with the lecture here. Employment at will is a common law policy that is used throughout the United States, and basically what that says is employer or employee can end the contract or the employment at any time for any reason. And that's current in most states. I think Montana, the book mentioned, does not follow this, but you will find that there are exceptions to an at-will situation for employment. Three of the exceptions are an implied contract, or you could have a tort cause or theory behind it, or there could be public policy. Those three are exceptions. Now let's explain them a little bit more. An implied contract is, think of an employment handbook, an employee handbook. Inside of the handbook are all types of expectations that the employee can expect from their employer. Along with that, you'll find employer expectations, which say you need to do this, this, and this. If all of those are followed, then in theory, one cannot be just simply let go or terminated. The other kind, the other way of looking at this is there's an implied in many cases, that there may just be one statement: the employee will not be fired unless there is just cause or good cause, and you've heard that many times. And finally, if the if the employer gives oral promises and they are expected to be kept. So that becomes underneath this implied contract theory. Under the tort theory, okay, if you have an employer who intentionally inflicts emotional distress and defamation on an employee, the employee can sue for unfair practices. So there's a balance there. Finally, you have public policy, and one biggie here is whistleblowing. You can't discharge somebody for whistleblowing, or for talking with a union representative, or many normal tasks or normal situations that an employee might run across. If an employee sees something being done unlawfully in a business and they whistleblow, that employee cannot be fired for that reason. It looks like we have a question, so I'll let you go do your question, and I'm going to move on to wages, hours, and layoffs. Okay, so we're back at wages, hours, and layoffs, and this is just going to involve many federal statutes that have come down since the early 1930s that still have precedent over our employment laws. There's a Davis-Bacon, which set up that federal employers must pay the prevailing wages, and that was put into practice in 1931, and prevailing wages would simply mean if somebody's getting paid $10 an hour and everybody else is getting paid that's a prevailing wage. So it forced federal employers to pay that same wage. You have the Walsh-Healey, which set up for minimum wage and overtime for federal contracts in 1936. And you have the biggie, the Fair Labor Standards Act, 1938, which did the wages and hours to all workers. And that's called the FLSA. This act really covers a lot of our employment issues. It covered child labor, and for any of you that have went to work, under 14, there are really serious work restrictions. You may be able to deliver a paper or work for your parents. 14 or 15, you can't do any hazardous work. Your hours are restricted, and there's a bit of policy to follow. That also works around your school, when you're in school and out of school. 16 to 18, there's still no hazardous work, but there are no hour restrictions. So child labor was a really big thing back in the early 20s and 30s. This has really changed not only our society, but a child's life, and actually education. So if they weren't working, they had to be in school, I guess. Wages and hours. Right now, the minimum wage is $7.25. That's really going to change here, I think, very quickly, because we have Walmart and we have who was the other big one? Oh, McDonald's just came through that they're raising the minimum wage at their corporate headquarters. So that's going to change, but right now the minimum wage, I believe, is $7.25. This also affected tip work. If you're a waitress or a service person who's waiting tables, you typically will get the federal mandated $2.13 mandatory wage for that field or that area of employment. And then your tips should bring you up to at least minimum wage. If they don't, then the employer has to make up the difference. Now, what's really interesting about this is the bookkeeping that's required to maintain the tip work. I believe you can also, if the employer doesn't want to do all the bookwork, they can pay you minimum wage, take the tips, and then disperse them the way they want. So sometimes it's easier to do that, quite honestly. Then we look at overtime exemptions, and overtime is anything over 40 hours within a week. So administrators are usually exempt, and executives are usually exempt. And if you were to work 45 hours or 10 hours a day in a 24-hour period, that would not constitute overtime unless you did that for 5 days a week, and then you would have 10 hours of overtime. So a 4-day period of working 10 hours a day does not constitute 2 hours of overtime each day. It has to be within a 5-day work week. Then we had quite a few layoffs. I think this began back in the 70s. A new act was put out. It was called Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification, or the WARN Act. This said that you can't lay off a group of people without proper notice. And that proper notice is 60 days. And typically this is for larger employers with more than 50 employees, usually over 100 employees. They have to notify you 60 days before they do the layoff. And it has to be a mass layoff, which is usually considered 1/3 of the full-time workers. So there are some protections and some warnings to help employees be able to prepare for a layoff. And another question, go do your thing, and I'll meet you back at Employee Privacy Act. Rights, sorry about that. Employee Privacy Acts. I've kind of swirled this around from the book. I wanted to put everything that involved employees directly as far as work is concerned in the same place, and we're going to do the Privacy Acts, and then part 2 is going to look at health and safety. I think we covered these briefly in Chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken. Electronic monitoring. 50% of all employers engage in surveillance of some kind or the other, and that would include emails, blogs, messages, use of a smartphone if it's supplied by the employer. And they can, employers, as long as they tell you they're going to monitor your correspondence or your communication, the employee can expect not to have privacy. So that's very important to realize that usually employers will tell you, and you usually have no recourse for that unless it's private conversations. And that kind of depends on the policy of the company. There was an Electronic Communication Privacy Act which involved wiretapping, and basically it says third party cannot intercept information. Doesn't say a whole lot about employers. Now, employers typically cannot intercept something coming in on your own device, but if they provide the device, they have every right to intercept that information, simply because they're trying to protect protect company secrets, and possibly they want to monitor hours that people are working and what they're doing with their time. The Stored Communications Act, which is also a part of the Electronic Communications Act, basically says that access data that's stored on your personal device, if it's your own, cannot be accessed. And that really involves the carriers such as Verizon and Sprint, or Google even, I guess, because you have a Google Drive. They cannot access the data that you have stored So it's a sort of a firewall around your information. Now, if there's just cause to believe that there's illegal activity, that act does not apply at that time. We have drug testing, and again, we've talked about it a little bit. Federal workers, the Fourth Amendment kind of protects them against reasonable searches, but it depends on the job and the requirements of that job. So if that job is a top security position, or that job has something to do with the safety of another individual or of a department, then drug testing is allowed. And private workers, we really look at state laws, and those must be reasonable. Usually any position that deals with public safety or deals with any type of safety where another individual would be in danger if you were using drugs, drug testing is perfectly allowable. Well, here's the final question. And we have covered employment at will. We've covered the labor acts. We've covered employee privacy. So we'll end this one and start with part 2. Thank you for listening.